Another movement that emerged about this same period of time was called the Prayer Revival of 1857. It was an exciting move of God, not led by a particular person, but simply, well, it was technically started in New York City with a lay evangelist, not a professional preacher or pastor or evangelist, but a lay evangelist named Jeremiah Lamphere. And at the first prayer meeting, he asked people to come. 6 people showed up, but quickly it turned into a meeting of 10,000 people in New York City. And after 6 more months, prayer meetings started all over the United States, and it's estimated that 50,000 people came to Christ every week. Other parts of the world, interestingly enough, simultaneously uh, experienced similar prayer movement revivals, including England, India, South Africa, and Indonesia over the next few years. Um, Other movements that were similar in nature could be certainly the movement, the Welsh revival in 1903, the revival in Pyongyang, North Korea, in 1907, and the Kayonza Rwanda revival that began in 1932 that led to the Great East African Revival. Um, but it's interesting to note that prayer has always been one of the foundational signs or aspects or beginnings of a true renewal movement. Um, Other movements that should be mentioned in addition to the holiness movement and the Keswick movement were the camp meetings at Cane Ridge, Kentucky, that really began the camp meeting movement over the next century or so. I don't know if any of you have ever been to a camp meeting before, but it began in 1803 when somewhere in the middle of nowhere, really, which was Cane Ridge, Kentucky at the time, 50,000 people showed up for a prayer meeting and a revival meeting, and it grew from there. Edward Irving in England in the 19th century, around 1830 or so, I believe, he began some revival meetings that, in at least in the modern era, has one of the most verified recorded expressions of somebody speaking in tongues in his church during that time period. Also, Johann Blumhardt began healing homes in Germany that later revivalists and evangelists took that concept. In fact, that concept is still popular today, the high idea of healing homes even in North America. North American Shakers were known to speak in tongues in the 19th century. Even Mormons, Brigham Young, apparently one of the founders of the Mormon Church, it's recorded that he spoke in tongues, which leads us to an interesting paradox because I personally consider the Mormon movement as heterodox or unorthodox, and yet here you see somebody being used in a gift of the Holy Spirit, and that leads to some interesting questions which we can discuss in our discussion forum about the nature of how the Holy Spirit uses us, and whether or not this was a true. People often debate whether or not this was a true expression of the gift of the Holy Spirit. Was he deceived? Was he misled? But nevertheless, it was recorded that he spoke in tongues. The Russian Malakan revival of 1833, that was an early expression before the Pentecostal movement. It had a lot of similarities. The 1896 revival in North Carolina that led to the founding of the Church of God Cleveland, which became really probably the earliest or one of the earliest Pentecostal denominations. You also had other founders and leaders like Alexander Dowie. He founded or established Zion Tabernacle in Chicago, which became very, very popular, but he was a bit unorthodox at times. His church faced controversy, and after his death in 1907, however, a new preacher from Chicago, William Durham, had just received spirit baptism at Azusa Street, and many of Dowie's followers joined him. The largest legacy of Dowie's influence continues in San Francisco, where one of his followers, Daniel Bryant, helped establish Zion churches that are now, I believe, the largest Christian denomination in South Africa. John G. Lake helped also establish these churches as an early Pentecostal pioneer and evangelist. A.B. Simpson was a founder of the Christian and Missionary Alliance churches, very influenced by the Keswick movement. He believed in the baptism in the Holy Spirit. However, they had a difference of opinion regarding, in contrast to traditional Pentecostal churches in North America, they rejected the idea that tongues was the only initial evidence of Spirit baptism. Yes, many of those in CMA churches did and still do speak in tongues, but they do not consider it the only evidence of Spirit baptism. And so that led to a bit of an early split before, right around the time the Pentecostal movement started. Carrie Judd Montgomery was a significant evangelist even before the Pentecostal movement began, and her revival meetings carried over into the Pentecostal movement. She became a founding member of the Assemblies of God. She also regularly preached to African American audiences and received criticism for this, but she refused to stop. So did Marie Woodworth Etter. She was actually part of the prayer revival of 1857 and started an evangelistic ministry which carried over into the early Pentecostal movement. And she was also a founding member of the Assemblies of God. Other early leaders, one or two more that I have to mention. Why do I have a picture of the Kardashians on here? It's simply because their great grandfather went to Azusa Street. Interestingly enough, he was Armenian, and a prophecy was given to Armenian Christians at the turn of the century, warning them to flee. They came to Los Angeles and established themselves there. And so pray for the Kardashians. I don't think it's an accident that Kanye West has just produced an album called Jesus is King, and that I believe that God is using him and speaking to him as Kim Kardashian's husband. But pray for them as a family. They are from a Pentecostal background. And one or two last revivals that I want to mention are the Welsh revival of 1903 that I already mentioned, which was a significant revival of its time. Also, a revival that occurred almost simultaneously with the Azusa Street revival was a revival in 1905 in India of a similar nature, led by someone named Pandita Rambai. She's listed as one of the 100 most influential people in the 20th century in India, and very, very influential there. And one last one was the Pyongyang revival in 1907 in North Korea, of all places. At that time, it was so extensive, Pyongyang was called the Jerusalem of the East. But sadly, because of the communist expansion in North Korea ultimately became the most unreached and inaccessible nation currently in the world to the gospel. But those who were persecuted ultimately fled to South Korea and continued a thriving Christian movement that still exists today in South Korea. These are many of the global expressions of Christianity that occurred before, during, and after the Pentecostal movement. Next week, we're going to look specifically at the Azusa Street revival, its significance, what was unique about it, and how it led to global Pentecostal revival today. Looking forward to our discussion this week.